In this video, I'm going to be talking about how soldering is used in the glass industry, or more specifically, how stained glass soldering works. So first, we're going to go over the specific materials that are used in stained glass soldering. So lots of the materials are just common to every other type of soldering, such as a soldering iron, solder, like the actual solder metal, and flux. But when you are stained glass soldering, you also need copper foil. So the soldering iron is just a pretty typical soldering iron. It's just a soft soldering iron, so it doesn't need to be able to get super hot, usually around like 400 degrees Celsius. And then the actual solder that you use can be made out of many different materials. Like they usually are a combination of tin and lead at different percentages, but there can be a few other materials that it can be used with, especially if you don't want to use lead. There's sometimes can be like a tin copper instead of tin lead alloy that's lead free. But the so yeah, that's the material. And then the liquid flux is pretty simple, but then the copper foil is special because it is usually used with so the copper foil is used to actually be wrapped around the pieces of glass because solder won't hook to glass directly. So they just wrap the copper foil around the edges. Usually they use like a glue, or nowadays you can get copper foil with a sticky back that you can kind of peel off and put on. Or you can just use a glue and then put the copper foil over top of that because it's thin, so it bends easy and fits around the glass easy. And then the copper heats up really well, so that's why it is typically used. So I thought that was really cool. The liquid flux, it's very important because the flux just in the solder itself usually isn't enough for the project, or the solder doesn't have any flux to begin with. So you have to put down flux to make sure it bonds well and that it's a clean joints. And there's kind of a balancing act when you are putting the flux on, because if you make the flux too thick, like if you put too much down, it will splatter and make small pits and bubbles in your soldering seam. But if you put down too little, then it will leave irregular solder seams, and there'll be uncovered copper foil still. So you have to make sure you kind of get it in a good medium balance. And so when you start soldering, you'll lay out the pieces with the copper foil on the edges, how you want it to look. And then they do something called a tack solder, which is this: you put down a little bit of solder or flux at all the joints, and then you just solder a little bit of metal in that spot just to kind of hold all the pieces together to begin with. So that way you can go back through and you can solder along all the lines. But the way they solder is a little bit different than how you solder in other applications. So they typically don't, like when you're soldering on a circuit board, you hold the soldering iron to the piece that you're soldering, and then you kind of feed the flux or the solder into the part that you're soldering. But with stained glass soldering, you actually will hold the soldering iron a bit up above the place where you are soldering, and then you just push the solder into the soldering iron tip, and it will melt the solder and drip it down into the cracks, and it kind of fills over top and fills into the cracks, and it makes them nice, uniform solder, so that way, yeah. And so you kind of got to control your speed as you go along, which can be kind of difficult. It's a skill that takes a while to figure out, because you need to control your speed, because if you go too slow, it'll like ball up too much and there'll be too much solder there. But if you go too quick, then it'll be too thin and it won't cover the whole thing. And if you spend too long on one piece of glass, you can actually heat up the glass and crack it and break it. So you got to be careful with that. But here's my references of where I found all this information on stained glass soldering. So there you go.